This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 349 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. You hear me talk about my prospect models all the time on this show, so today we're going to talk about that a little bit, specifically with wide receivers. I had a fairly bad year in 2019 with evaluating wide receivers. I like some of the right guys like A.J. Brown, but I was higher than the consensus on Andy Isabella and J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, and that looks like a bad call. I got a question closer to the end of the season that I answered on a mailbag show that essentially asked, is it time to change your approach since you messed up this past year? And the short answer was no. You can't let one season and a few misses change the way that you approach things, as long as your approach is solid. And the approach overall had led me to some really strong results. I mean, the prospect model is why I named Kenny Golladay Babytron right after he was drafted by the Lions. But every year I try to refine the approach, and I did that once again this year. And in an effort to be more transparent about what goes into these models, I wanted to walk through some of the production-related factors that the models look at in order to explain why I'm higher and lower on certain players. Before doing that, though, I wanted to let you guys know that we're getting closer to golf's first major. So FanDuel is rewarding fans who make the cut by giving them a chance to compete for their share of $15,000. Just finish in the top 50% of users in the weekly streak-eligible contest, and your make-the-cut streak continues. Best of all, you don't need to worry about missing a week. Your streak stays alive until you fail to finish in the top 50%. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. So I want to start off at a high level here and explain the approach that I take with these models. Again, I want to be transparent and maybe even motivate some of you listening to build something of your own, because it's fun, and fantasy football is all about entertainment. My wide receiver database goes back to 2006, and it includes every relevant season. But the sample that I work with includes wideouts who are either drafted or who got invited to the combine. I then look at how all of those players performed during their first 3 years in the NFL. So for example, if a player went undrafted and he didn't go to the combine, but he somehow did really well during the first 3 seasons, he's not included in the data set. You have to draw the line somewhere. The goal of the model was really to beat draft capital. Meaning if my prospect scores can predict first 3-year success way better than draft capital can, or where players get drafted, then that's a big win. And it does that by a very large margin. The model itself does include draft capital though. So think of it this way, and this goes for both the wide receiver and the running back model. When you compare the metrics used for the model versus where a player got drafted, there's not a whole lot of differentiation in how predictive things are. The metrics used without draft capital isn't necessarily more predictive than draft capital itself. That's not super surprising because high draft capital for a player not only means that he'll likely get an immediate shot to play, but there's talent evaluation within draft capital. A team liked a player to spend a high pick on him, so we should assume that that player isn't bad at football. The thing is, when you factor in draft capital into the model, things get sweet. The model becomes way more useful at predicting the output during a player's first 3 seasons versus looking strictly at draft capital. And I'm not ashamed of using capital either. I'm trying to win in fantasy football. My goal isn't to predict where a player should be drafted. And since the majority of rookie drafts and redraft league drafts happen after the NFL draft, it only makes sense to use that information in order to be more precise. Now, every one of these players has a prospect score that gets calculated by looking at a number of different factors. Today, I'm going to look at the production factors that go into that score. But keep in mind that things like breakout age, BMI, strength of competition, there are a lot of things that are factored into this prospect score. The 3 main production-related categories for the wide receiver model, though, are receptions per game, yards per team attempt, and touchdown share. That's it. And those are all final season numbers. If a player didn't play that much during their final year, then his most recent relevant season is used. I should add that return yards are a nice boost if there's sort of a WTF type player like Deontay Johnson who gets drafted earlier than expected. But that's not factored into the model. It's sort of an after the fact look. So I want to talk through those 3 main statistical categories today. We'll look at all wide receivers who are going to the combine this year, and we'll compare their statistical profiles to stud wide receivers in the NFL. That way you can get an idea of which players produce like studs, hence the title of today's show. Because generally speaking, players who are productive in the NFL were also productive in college. That means successful NFL wide receivers, successful fantasy receivers, were really good within the production metrics that I just talked through. If they weren't, then the model wouldn't work. But what does being successful at the NFL even mean? For purposes of this podcast and to talk through things, to define that term, I just looked at the 34 wide receivers since 2011 who played D1 ball, who also have finished with multiple top 20 seasons. And I filtered out geriatrics like Larry Fitzgerald since his college data went further back than 2006. So, for example, those 34 stud wide receivers, when they were in college, they averaged 6.6 receptions per game during their final collegiate season. Unsurprisingly, among the 55 wideouts who were invited to the combine, their receptions per game was significantly lower at 4.7. That's a near 2 receptions per game difference. When looking at yards per team attempt, the stud wide receiver sample averaged almost 3 yards per team attempt. The 2020 class averaged fewer than 2. And then the stud wide receivers had a touchdown share during their final season of 41.4%. This year's class, it was closer to 27%. So the stud wideouts did way better than the list of combine invites. That's not shocking. The question is, which players in this year's class then failed to perform in those 3 statistical categories? Which ones didn't even come close to performing like a stud during their final collegiate season? Now, I should mention that these 3 metrics likely work well together because yards per team attempt can often favor big play receivers, whereas receptions per game can be higher for players with lower average depth of targets in pass-heavy offenses. So when you combine the two, it helps create a strong profile. That's at least the logic that I'm using as to why these things seem to work. Regardless, 2 players really stood out as underperforming when looking at these metrics. One is Jalen Reagor, and the other is Henry Ruggs. Reagor's on the top of some people's draft boards at wide receiver. If you look at some website rankings like ESPN's prospect rankings, he's ranked a lot lower. So he's a polarizing player. He does have a lot of positives to his profile. He had an elite breakout age, he's entering the draft as a junior, and he was a returner too. Because he didn't perform well statistically doesn't mean that he's a bad prospect. There are some statistical red flags though. People seem to be brushing off his 2019 season because TCU's offense was trash. And that's fair to a degree. The fact that TCU is pretty run heavy doesn't help his receptions per game average either. But this is also why we look at market share numbers, or yards per team attempt, which is in the context of a player's specific offense. Reagor was below average there. Now, if you look at his 2018 season, things look a lot better. That's really why I still like Reagor despite his poor final season numbers. We've seen situations like this before. But I can't deny that final season numbers are the most predictive, and his were lacking. It's a red flag and something to keep in mind. Otherwise, he's a really good prospect. And if he gets strong draft capital to back everything up, then I'll likely care even less about those final season numbers. Henry Ruggs is a different story, though. ESPN's prospect rankings have Ruggs as the 3rd best wideout. Walter Football has him as the 3rd best wideout. DraftScout.com has him as the 3rd best wideout. It's usually Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, and then Henry Ruggs. My model doesn't see it. Ruggs averaged 3.3 receptions per game last year. That was below average for the 2020 class. He had a yards per team attempt of 1.84, which was also below average. His 14% touchdown share was 7 percentage points lower than the average as well, which means all of those numbers were way below the NFL stud average. Ruggs' aggregate stat score, which weighs those 3 statistics appropriately, it ranks 38th of the 55 wide receivers who were invited to the combine this year. And if you look at her sample of studs, none of them had a stat score that's as low as Ruggs from 2019. The one player who's closest is Mike Wallace, which is interesting because they're both players who can really stretch the field. The big piece here that I haven't talked about is that Ruggs played with Jerry Jeudy, who's at the top of some draft boards, and Devontae Smith, who's going back to Alabama for his senior season. 2 things about that, though. The model does look at what I call a teammate factor, but it's not weighed very heavily, meaning it doesn't matter that much. Generally speaking, good players see good numbers because they're good. We saw that with A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf a year ago when we were looking at this stuff. So I tend to see that more as an excuse than anything else. And it's not like Ruggs is close to having good numbers. He's still pretty far away. And then on top of that, I couldn't find any meaningful way to use combine numbers with the wide receiver model. The combine matters a lot less at the position than it does at, say, running back and tight end, even though it's probably overrated there as well. So if Ruggs has a crazy 40 time, it really shouldn't change the way that we feel about him. My overall assessment on Ruggs based of all of this is that number one, he'll still look okay enough in my model if he has good draft capital. But I'll likely not view him as a top-notch, high-end fantasy asset because he doesn't profile to one. To me, he might just be a better real-life player than a fantasy one. Reagor and Ruggs are two players who stood out the most, just given how much people are talking about them. They were the two players I wanted to talk about most today on the negative side. There really weren't huge discrepancies elsewhere. But let's look on the flip side. Which players looked really good statistically? Which players hit on all three averages from our stud wide receiver sample? There were actually two receivers who hit on all three marks. The first was Omar Bayless from Arkansas State. You may have no idea who this guy is since he's a smaller school guy, but he averaged over 7 receptions per game, a yards per team attempt of over 3.5, and a touchdown share of nearly 46%. Those are studly numbers. But they also, like I said, came against weak competition. And Bayless actually didn't do a whole lot until his final season, which is not a great sign. And we can't expect draft capital to be on his side. So let's push Bayless aside from now and look at the other player who hit on these metrics, which is Tyler Johnson. Johnson has an elite breakout age, and his final season receptions per game, yards per team attempt, and touchdown share were all above the NFL stud average. Especially his yards per team attempt, which is the stat that gets the most weight in my model. The biggest downside with Johnson right now is that he's not locked in as an elite prospect in this class, so he may not get drafted super high. And he also didn't declare early, which is somewhat of an issue. But statistically, he's amazing. I'm sure you guys want to know who else did well within the stat score in my model. Devin Duvernay popped up in third, but the rest of his profile isn't super strong. He only had one strong year of production, so he had a late breakout age, and he didn't declare early either. Those aren't great signs, and it's doubtful that he goes super high in the draft, so the model's just not going to like him that much overall when it's all said and done. Isaiah Hodgins is another guy that the stat score liked, and he's more interesting than Duvernay in my opinion. He's an early declare, he was well above average in all three stat categories, and he has a sub 20-year-old breakout age. He's someone to watch as we move through the process. And I guess that I should talk about Jerry Jeudy and CeeDee Lamb since they're generally the consensus top wideouts in the class. My model likes them both. And with draft capital, they'll likely be the top two wide receivers in this class according to the model. Now that may sound surprising for those of you who have looked at Jeudy's numbers. According to playerprofiler.com, he's got just a 36th percentile dominator rating. That doesn't scream success. But he actually had pretty strong final season marks in receptions per game and yards per team attempt. His stat score is lower than I'd like, but there are a couple of wide receivers from our studs group who had stat scores as low as Jeudy's. And then when you factor in that he played with other pros and then he has a really strong breakout age, Jeudy's really not a bad prospect analytically. Saying he's a bad prospect analytically is a tough sell in my opinion. Lamb is just as good of a prospect. My worry with both guys is that they have smaller BMIs than you'd like to see from top tier wide receivers. But I'm also not using official height and weight measurements right now because the combine hasn't happened. So take that with a grain of salt. I'd probably put Lamb ahead of Jeudy, but I do think that they're 1 and 2 in this class right now. And then one more guy before I let you guys go. I know I'm sort of rambling through things here, but I figured that you want to hear some takes on these guys since this is the first show where I'm really talking through things. Bryan Edwards is an analytical darling. People who prospect through data love Bryan Edwards. He's got one of the best breakout ages that you could possibly find. He had similar numbers as Deebo Samuel last year at South Carolina. His dominator rating is in the 94th percentile. The dude looks great on paper. Aside from the fact that he wasn't an early declare, Edwards also scored pretty poorly in yards per team pass attempt. A lot of that is due to the fact, according to Pro Football Focus, that he only had 4 deep receptions last year. That ranked tied for 197th. He caught a ton of screens. That basically tells us that we don't know exactly how his game is going to translate. He's a fun prospect given all the measurables, but I do think that there are some question marks about his profile. Now we're going to learn more about these guys at the combine, but I can tell you that I'm not all that concerned about how they perform athletically unless they're outliers. I'm more concerned about how teams may be starting to view them, the momentum that they gain as a result, and to be honest, their straight up height and weight. Because that's an input that actually matters in my model. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And remember, with the off-season mailbags, which will be on Friday, feel free to email me those questions at jj@numberfire.com. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.